You're listening to the Talking Headways podcast network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Lisa Jerram of APTA and Philip Plotch of the Eno Center for Transportation to discuss Eno's report, Customization, Competition, and Costs, Findings and Recommendations for the U.S. Transit Bus Industry. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super amazing and kind Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of bus riders, bus drivers, and chupistas, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. And if you want to just give a single $1 a month, you'll be able to get the podcast with 0 outside ads or podcast recommendations in Patreon. We'll leave information in the show notes about how to get the show in your podcatcher. We'll also recently put up some bonus material, including audio of my first ever e-bike ride, and have a weekly free post from our newsletter intro, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, get your heavyweight bus and bike scarves. You'll definitely need one for you, your friends, your colleagues, just to show everyone in that city hall or legislature your advocacy in clothing that won't get taken by security on the way in. If you want to get one of the bus or bike scarves or the lightweight bike scarf for hot climates, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. But there are many other ways to support the show, including buying books from us on the bookshop site, either the books from our authors that we interview or any book you like. bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarecholesterol. And for anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook that plays like a podcast, visit theoverheadwire.com. You can also get that podcast from Libby at your public library. And finally, definitely sign up for the 20-year-old newsletter we do at theoverheadwire.com, established in 2006, and our over 110,000 item link archive tagged by topic and city. We'll leave a YouTube explainer video in the show notes as well for that one too. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that as well. You can find us mostly on Blue Sky and Mastodon, sometimes on Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. We've got some great stuff coming up for you in our 13th year of the podcast, so keep on listening for announcements on gatherings, but for now, just enjoy the show. Hey everybody, I decided to move this part of my thank yous up from the post-credits to right here smack dab at the start because I do want to recognize the folks who are Dallas tier or higher Patreon supporters. It really helps us out and we super appreciate it. When I get new supporters, I'll update this section, so I hope that happens often. So first names only, but big thanks to Andrew, Ben, Derek, Gabriel, Glenn, Greg, James, Jeremy, Jim, Joseph, Catherine, Mal, Marcus, Matthew, Mike, Nicholas, Abraham, Oliver, Steve, Abby, Matthew, Sylvia, and recently added Andrew A. All right, thank you all very much. Let's get to the show. Philip Plotch and Lisa Jerram, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
Nice to see you in person.
Yeah, nice to see you as well. You know, you hear people on podcasts all the time and you're never quite sure what they look like. And so now you can see my face.
Exactly.
You notice I did not say you have a face for podcast.
Yeah, well, that's good. Well, before we get started, can you tell us all a little bit about yourself? And we'll start with Lisa and we'll go with Phil.
All right. So Lisa Jerram, and I work for the American Public Transportation Association. Your audience probably knows, but for anyone who doesn't, we're the trade association based out of Washington, D.C., representing and advocating for public transit across North America. We're a membership organization, so we have public transit agencies across the country who are members, and also all the businesses that support them. And we do a lot of things at APTA, which people will think of maybe the government advocacy part. We do a lot of meetings. People might have been to those. I personally, my particular focus is on bus transit stuff, for lack of a better way of putting it, which is committees, things like that. So bus transit, my nickname here is the bus lady at APTA.
So I've been at the Eno Center for the past 4 years. We're independent, we're nonprofit, we're a nonpartisan research center, and it's a multimodal research center. Although somebody like me does definitely skew towards transit, bike, and pedestrian. But for that, I was in academia and I wrote 3 books. I wrote a book about the Second Avenue subway, a book about replacing the Tappan Zee Bridge, and a book about the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And I learned how to get into the weeds, and I learned how to get people to explain why. which is so helpful. And those little skills and experiences help when you write a report about bus customization or just about any other report to like understand like what people's incentives are, why people do the things they do, and then try to change it, which is much harder than trying to figure out why people are doing what they're doing. I worked at the MTA in New York, and after 9/11, I worked on redeveloping the World Trade Center site in Lower Manhattan. So I've had a great career so far and really enjoying working at the Eno Center because I get to do the things that I enjoy doing oftentimes, which is talking to people. And when I'm curious about something, so I was curious about how is retail space doing in transit stations? I put a webinar together. Or I want to find out what transportation reporters, how they do their jobs and what they look for. And I just brought some transportation reporters in and had a webinar. So I do enjoy, I think, asking questions more than I like to answer questions.
So you're on the wrong side of this microphone today. I was interested in hearing about how you get people to explain why, because that's my job too. And sometimes it's hard, right? Sometimes it's hard to like dig in and try to get something that's important out. If there's a little nugget of information that you can try to pull that might be super interesting to an audience or the people who are reading a report. How do you do that? Like, is it a long conversation? Is it a short conversation? Do you just have to show them that you know what you're talking about and then they'll start talking to you in a different way?
So it's getting people to like you and trust you is the key. My first job out of college was working at IBM. And IBM, they teach you how to be marketing all the time, right? It's what you wear and it's developing relationships with people. It was nice to have tickets to Madison Square Garden events and take people. I don't have that anymore, So it actually can be difficult to develop relationships with people since we're all like remote, right? But you can do it. You can explain to people that you know what you're talking about, and you can explain to people that they're in a safe space and tell people that you're just trying to inform other people. And sometimes if you flatter people, it also helps a lot, right?
And Lisa, I'm wondering, like, have buses been a lifelong obsession or is it just something you picked up later on in life?
Well, I mean, it does seem like a funny thing to say that you're really into buses. I will admit, as the bus lady, even I find that a little surprising. I've always been, well, I should always, for most of my career, working in sustainable transportation. So that I was very interested in. Many years ago, I was actually working for an association promoting electric cars. I mean, that was like a million years ago. And so I kind of got into it that way. I really liked the idea of something new. I learned something new and it was good for the environment. So that was great. And it sort of evolved over time. I worked for a couple of different nonprofits, and there was one of them where we started working on hybrid buses. And I thought, gosh, that's not going to be very interesting. I'm not excited by buses. It's not going to be great. And I started doing it, and I was doing research, kind of like you do, Phil. So I was asking questions and found out transit agencies will tell you all kinds of stuff. It is great. If you want to learn something and do great research, transit is one of the best places to do it because we're very open, very honest. They love to share. And it's just a really kind of interesting environment to be in. And I got really excited by it. And so years went by. I was interested in APTA for quite a while. And at some point, someone I knew at APTA, they were looking for somebody new to come in. And at that time in particular, the whole zero emission thing was really kind of taking off. And I had that particular expertise. So that was valuable for that reason. So here we are, and I've been at APTA for 8 years. And I think transit is when people get into it, they really get into it and they love it.
Yeah, we all like to draw the lines on the maps and look at the buses and the trains as they go by.
Exactly.
Well, so I wanted to have you all on because you've written a new report, Customization, Competition, and Costs, Findings and Recommendations from the U.S. Transit Bus Industry. What was the initial impetus for this one?
We at the Eno Center have been looking at issues like project delivery and costs and trying to figure out how to help transit agencies. And one thing that came up from a lot of people was this issue of customization. If you think about you're walking and you're buying a Toyota or any other car, you wouldn't just walk into a dealer and say, oh, this is a great model, but can you just swap out the air conditioning unit and maybe change the window frames and move the cup holders and, oh, I don't really like those color screws and a different color seatbelt and let's turn these seats around. Like you just couldn't imagine doing it. And if a company had to do that, if the car dealer was able to actually like create a car, it's almost like a Rolls Royce. customizing a car. You just have to have a lot more engineers to do that. And you have to stock a whole lot more parts. You'd have to test all of these different components, right? Here's this new air conditioning system that is it going to work with the filters you have? Is it going to work with all the ductwork you have? You have to test everything separately. Who knows? Like there might be some sort of a wireless frequency conflict between the different components. Or maybe you're going to have overheating because you're not used to having this certain part. And at the end of the day, you're going to pay a lot more for that car. It's going to take a lot longer for it to come. And you're probably going to have a lot more quality issues because if you have an automated manufacturing facility, one car after another car after another car, it's going either by people or by robots getting different parts that are put on. But if everything has to swap out, if you have to change the parts, change the work processes, all of a sudden everything becomes more expensive and that quality actually gets impaired. So to us, it seemed like a win-win-win. If we can reduce customization, we can lower the cost that transit agencies have to pay. We could speed up the delivery of the buses and we can get better buses. It just seemed like sort of an easy thing to take on. It seemed like an easy thing to take on.
I don't want to laugh too hard when you said it seemed like an easy thing to take on, but
After reading the report, I feel like I understand the seam in that.
So I think one of the most important things that we did in our report was to figure out why transit agencies are doing this. So what they'll do is they'll issue a request for proposal, an RFP, and they'll put all of these different specs in it. And then the manufacturer has to respond to this. And putting those specs together can take 6, 9, 12 months because there's so many different parts and components in a bus. And you have all of these different people looking at these things. And it's not just the bus maintenance people and the operators, but it's also the lawyers and the financial people and the insurance people. Everybody's like looking at what should go into that RFP. So the RFP gets issued, the manufacturer then has to figure out, oh, how are they going to respond to that? They don't usually use those different components. So they'll look at this RFP and they'll have like 300-400 different recommendations for how you should change that bus that was spec'd out and customized to meet the agency's needs. The reasons why they're doing it, I think are really interesting. One is they think there's something unique about their place, and sometimes there is. So San Francisco has really steep hills, and you need a more powerful engine to handle that. Phoenix obviously is a little bit hotter. Boston has to worry because not only is there salt on the road during the winter, but also there's salt that's sprayed in from the harbor. So they need a different, more robust bus. New York thinks they need the most robust bus in the world. They think it's the heaviest use. The roads are really bad. So those are, you could say, pretty valid reasons, or at least they think they're really valid reasons. But then there's a lot of other reasons they do this. One is they're a little bit leery of changing the way their buses have always been built. If you're a customer, all of a sudden you get onto a new bus and the seating arrangement's a little bit different, or it used to be you pressed a button and now it's a strip or you pull a cord, or maybe the wheelchair gets tied on a little bit differently, you're kind of resistant to that. And agencies, what's more important than the idea of customization is keeping their customers happy. But the same thing with the operators or the bus drivers. You want to keep them happy too. They're sitting in this seat for 8 hours a day and they want their instruments a certain way. They want this sort of mobile office of theirs to be comfortable for them. And you want, if you're a transit agency head, you want your operators to be happy and you want your customers to be happy. So a lot of reasons that they come up with, but I think one of the biggest reasons they come up with for all of this customization is they want consistency with all of their previous buses. They want to minimize the number of spare parts they have. They want to minimize the training requirements they have. And they just sort of used to certain kinds of products, a certain air conditioning unit or certain windshield wipers or whatever it is. There are certain things that they kind of get used to, and then they want to just keep that. So they want this consistency within their fleet. But ironically, the best thing for everybody was if there was more consistency across the country. But that's hard to do, making this shift.
So one thing I'll just say, just to clarify, is this is Phil's, Eno's report, right? I mean, the reason I'm here is that we, APTA, were part of a group, a panel that advised, as they were doing it, which again, I will say to your credit, you had a lot of folks from the transit industry, ourselves, APTA, of course, the bus manufacturers, transit agencies, and, we've all been in this world for a long time. So I think people are kind of very into like how things are done, and you can sort of get a little bit lost in that. And you had to be able to kind of pull it together and then look a bit kind of broadly and say, okay, here's how it looks and here's what we think you could do, rather than kind of being right in the middle of it, which is I think what we are sometimes in the transit world. But I would say too, honestly, for APTA's perspective, I would broaden this a little bit, because our interest came through a desire to sort of shore up or secure the health of the bus manufacturing industry overall in the US. From what APTA's perspective was, we started out in 2023 with a bus manufacturing task force, and that was driven by losing a couple of bus manufacturers from the US market. And we already had a fairly small number as it was. People either decided to stop manufacturing in the US, a very significant manufacturer declared bankruptcy. And we were looking all of a sudden at having a really small number of manufacturers to supply the market, and sort of trying to figure out what's going on here. We need to take some action as an industry to ensure that this industry, the bus industry, is a healthy one. So from our perspective, I would say, honestly, it's a little broader than just the customization piece. Customization was identified as one of the challenges for the manufacturers. That is definitely a key challenge. We also focused a lot on sort of the contracts, the terms and conditions that agencies were putting through their procurements, and the impacts that had on the financial health of the manufacturers. And that can sort of be considered as part of customization in a way. I mean, so what we APTA have done is we have what I'll call the white book. It's what it's normally called. The longer name is the Standard Bus Procurement Guidelines. And it is kind of what it sounds like, which is a very long template, long as in like 300 plus pages, that APTA has maintained over about like 25 or 30 years and updated over those years, that agencies can use to create their RFPs. And we are focused on streamlining that document and encouraging and kind of reducing some of the kind of the many options that are available in that, either the technical options or the contract options, and streamlining that and making that document a better document that will help address some of this customization. So from our perspective, I would say, again, it's sort of more broadly, how can we kind of streamline overall this procurement process, make it less burdensome, potentially, of course, for the manufacturers, but also for the agencies, honestly, because it can be kind of a difficult process for them. That can help bring down costs of bus. It can help encourage new companies to come into the US market, and, just kind of improve the bus industry overall.
So is that the main issue then, the costs of the bus? Is that kind of what brings everybody to the table, is like, we're spending so much more money than we think we should on these buses, and it's going up over time because we're losing manufacturers? Is that kind of like a unifying principle, or is it just like a whole bunch of things that kind of bring it together like that?
I would say those were important, but I think there's also a concern about the existing manufacturers and the supply chain. During COVID, I think the word supply chain we all learned a little bit more about what that term means. When in the United States, the federal government pays for 80% of a transit agency's bus, which means they have a lot of say in what kind of buses we can buy at the transit agencies. One of the biggest requirements is this Buy America requirement, which means that transit agencies can only buy buses that are made in the United States. So they're assembled in the United States, and then most of the components have to be purchased from United States companies that are actually made in the United States. And we were thinking a lot, and APTA's been thinking a lot about this also, is how do you bring in more manufacturers? And how do you make sure that the existing manufacturers are strong? And it's not just the manufacturers we worry about, we also worry about the suppliers.
Right.
We worry about the manufacturers of seats and engines and air conditioning systems, and we want to make sure they're strong. And one of the challenges we have in the United States is there's about 16 million cars and SUVs that are made every year. There's only about 4,000 or 5,000 buses that are made every year. So it's a relatively small market, and we want to make sure there's good competition, but at the same time, we want to make sure that the manufacturers are strong, because if a manufacturer goes out of business, they're not going to be there to support you. They're not going to be there to provide the parts. They're not going to be there to provide the training. So we were thinking a lot about the manufacturing industry as a whole for buses. And I just want to say that Lisa was such a great resource on the advisory panel, as well as the other advisory panel members. It really helped us at Eno understand this. We went in not really understanding like what was going on, why things were going on, and what could potentially work.
Can you compare 5,000 buses? I mean, 16 million cars, you can kind of understand that. But I mean, when you look at Europe or you look at China or you look at other countries who are making buses and building them and at a lower cost, like how many buses are they making in Europe, or how many buses are they making in China as compared to that 5,000 number, as a kind of a comparison for folks to kind of wrap their heads around the idea of how many buses we are making or not making?
So in Europe, it's about 40,000 buses. And it's a little bit different in Europe because they tend to buy in bulk more. There's more joint purchasing. There's also more private operators in Europe. So if you are a private operator and you're running service in 6 different European cities, you're going to buy buses for 6 different European cities. So you'll consolidate that purchase, and then you'll have that ability to get not just more standard buses, but also more efficiency in the marketplace and be able to keep the price a little bit lower. Lisa, are you aware of outside of Europe, the bus market at all?
I don't know the numbers actually for what it is. Obviously, China, the numbers are going to be enormous. But I think that comparison with Europe really shows you the difference, though. My impression is that people are sometimes surprised because usually the US is a big market for anything, right? But in this particular product, if you will, it isn't really a very big market. I mean, and the other thing, too, is, if you're talking about the cost, I think Phil really answered it really well, actually, which is we want to make sure that the bus manufacturers that we have are like healthy businesses and that they can continue to supply our, need for transit buses, and, that we could encourage new companies to come into the market. I think that's always good to have that happen. There are going to be other things that affect cost differences between the US market and Europe besides the customization. Customization is one of the factors, but you have to think about, the Buy America. We already talked about that. That obviously is just, it's regulation that is going to be increasing the supply chain, increasing the prices. We have a 12-year life requirement for buses, right, that are purchased with FTA funds. And I believe in Europe, I think the typical life of buses may be more like around 8 years. That's my understanding, certainly, I think, for like the London buses, the TfL buses. It's just a more expensive bus. I mean, just inherently, obviously, something that lasts 12 years is going to cost more than something that lasts 8 years. There's some APTA requirements that are a little bit different. So there's a lot of different factors. I think it's, you want to make sure you're kind of comparing apples to apples when you're talking about like what the differences are in the prices.
Yeah. Just to think about the size of the market. So not only is it about 4,500 buses a year, but then you sort of disaggregate it. So you have the 40-foot buses, and then you have the 60-foot articulated buses, right? So that means there's even fewer buses of the same thing made. And then we have different propulsion types. So traditionally it's been a diesel bus, but there's a lot of CNG buses out there. There's hybrid electric buses, and there's hydrogen fuel cell buses, and there's also battery electric buses. That's a lot of different kinds of buses that are coming out there. In Europe, I think almost all the buses that are being produced now are battery electric. And European manufacturers, when they think about entering the United States, they don't see that market as necessarily being stable and strong for battery electric buses.
Yeah, it's kind of got some fits and starts. I mean, we had a couple of manufacturers, and then now they're gone. Proterra was one, and we had the bosses at Proterra on when they first started. So that kind of shows you how old our podcast is. But yeah, it's interesting to see that. And also in China specifically, I know that like Shenzhen, all of their buses, I think they have like 40,000 buses that are running in that agency specifically. Editor's note, Shenzhen operates around 16,000 buses. So there's just like so many places that are doing that. And here it just hasn't seemed to take on. And part of that's probably because there are only 5,000 buses manufactured a year, and also those specifications that we have for the hardening of these buses. In the New York case study was very fascinating, and you mentioned this, but the New York case study is really fascinating at the amount of strengthening these buses have to go through in order to be able to operate in New York City for 12 years straight, right? Can you kind of give us an idea of what they're looking for when they're trying to build a bus specifically for New York?
So one of the things that they do in New York is they have what they call a shaker table, where they'll actually put a bus on this device that tries to simulate what it's like to have a bus in New York dealing with the potholes and dealing with all the starts and stops and dealing with all the people getting on and off and dealing with sort of the stretching and bending that buses go through. And what has happened in the United States is because New York has this robust test, the manufacturers, when they build their buses, not only do they have to meet the standards of the United States, which has its own robust testing, but also New York standards. So New York standards almost become the national standards. So the bus in New York, maybe they do need a really strong bus, but they don't need that same kind of bus in Phoenix or in Albuquerque or something as they do in New York because they're not running as many hours, they're not having as many people, the roads are a little bit different. In New York also, they have more experts than the bus manufacturer does. So they have engineers who can actually design braking systems, and they've designed their own braking system that they want on their buses. They have certain requirements because they have things that other places don't have. So there's something called bus surfing in New York. You've probably all heard of subway surfing, which is I highly recommend not doing. Well, there are people who are doing bus surfing also. So you have to harden the top of the bus in New York in a way that you don't have to do in other places. That you can consider customization, or you could just say it's a feature, or you could just say we have to do this. Depends on how you look at it. Another thing is in New York, there are 12,000 bus drivers. And that means there's going to be a lot of crime that happens against these bus drivers. And if you're the head of the agency, you want to make sure they're all safe. So you're really careful about creating this enclosure for the bus driver so they are super safe, whether it's from somebody on the outside or somebody on the inside trying to hurt them. So New York is definitely leading because of their size, because they are buying about 10% of the buses every year. But at the same time, it's costing a little bit more money and they are customizing more. They actually have their own funds. They don't even have to use federal funds. So if the federal government told them to do something, they could just say, it's okay, we'll use federal funds for something else and we'll buy buses with our own money.
Have they thought about just manufacturing them themselves? Like that's what we do for our cable cars here in San Francisco. So, maybe just like go another level, right? It seems kind of insane.
So if you check out the signal system for the subways, which like date back to the 1930s, there's actually machine shops that create it. You can't buy signal systems or parts for 1930s equipment. So they do have their own signal system shop there.
Nice.
We have a paint shop here in San Francisco because it's needed for the trolleys and the cable cars. So then you kind of explained this next question, which is like, how did agencies get so much power over customization? It's because they all have their little fiefdoms, it feels like. And over time, it's probably stacked on top of itself, kind of a Russian nesting doll of customization, where, they're asking for more. And then, as you mentioned in the report, it kind of becomes standard after the first time it's in there. And then so they ask for more after that.
Yeah. One of the things to understand about the industry is that suppliers will have all sorts of marketing initiatives to sell their products directly to the transit agencies. So if you go to a bus conference, you'll see somebody selling steering wheels, somebody selling seats, somebody selling heating units. And what they're doing is they're trying to get the transit agencies to put those components into their specs. And what that does is it just increases the amount of customization. And the more that transit agencies customize, the more there is an incentive for these suppliers to market directly to the transit agency. To me, it reminded me of when you watch a football game and you see like some pharmaceutical product that's sold that they're trying directly to sell to the consumer. And I'm always thinking, I have no idea what this means. And the doctor should be like filtering this sort of stuff out. So it'd be nice if the bus manufacturers could filter it out, but that's just not how it works. The bus manufacturers get a lot of pressure from the transit agencies to add these components that the transit agencies have seen at conferences or in brochures or in videos or whatever.
And that's one of the things that this APTA White Book is designed to try to move the industry away from. The whole point of it is to put in technical specifications that are performance-based, as opposed to really specifying something that would indicate that you want a particular vendor's product. And that has been like a goal of the White Book for quite a while, is to ensure at least that if an agency is putting out an RFP and what they're asking for is going to be, if you can meet that performance requirement, then you can, respond to the RFP. It is designed to try to, minimize that kind of like very specific, I think, direct specification, if you will, from the agency. Can't say that it always necessarily works. Of course, agencies are free to modify as they wish. And indeed, some of them are going to, like Phil said. And sometimes they have reasons to do it. Again, it gets pretty complicated in terms of what happens internally at the agency. The mechanics are accustomed to dealing with particular components, or even, maybe they've had better experiences with one company's products or components than others. And they sort of think, okay, well, we know this is what we want to use. So that's where you end up, it gets kind of sticky, I think, I would say, trying to avoid some of the kind of things that Phil's talking about.
I don't envy Lisa's position of trying to update that white book to get people all around the country to agree on certain components. But one thing to understand about the white book, it's voluntary. So it's great, it's detailed, has lots of information, and it would be great if everybody could use it. But some of the larger transit agencies use maybe 70% of it. The smaller agencies use a lot more of it. But it'd be great if Lisa had a little more time to go around the country expounding on the virtues of using the white book.
We should really highlight that, because that is something that we are, in all seriousness, we've been doing these task forces, and we have a new one that we're about to launch. The first two are about addressing terms and conditions and updating those in a way that would sort of balance the risk better between the agency and the manufacturer. And then the last one was really on customization, and we've made some updates. Phil mentioned earlier about like seating companies. We did some like standardized floor plans that are in the white book now. So you sort of would select from a couple of standardized floor plans. But the next phase is, how do we just put this out there and encourage agencies to use it? And also not just encourage, but I think genuinely some agencies don't necessarily know, everything that's in the white book, or understand all the components are in there, or why is this new element considered a best practice as opposed to what we've been doing before? What are the impacts of this new one versus what we did before? So that is going to be part of my job for the coming year.
How much this is also like our litigious society? I noticed a lot of like references to lawsuits, or, somebody won a lawsuit because the mirror got in the way of the driver's sight line, and so they hit person, and they sued the transit agency and they won a lot of money, and so now the agency wants to make the buses in a certain way. Or somebody had it written into law through a court order that they had to have like lights or something on a certain spot in the bus or whatever. Like, how much is it just like the litigiousness of American society that might not exist in other countries as heavily?
Yeah, I think the example you're giving was a SEPTA bus in Philadelphia, where somebody got hurt, and what the person did was they sued both the transit agency and the bus manufacturer. And they said that it wasn't designed in a safe manner. And it made transit agencies really nervous. And one of the things in Lisa's white book is, how do you deal with indemnity? Like, if we are sued, who's responsible? And you get sued once, you get sued twice, and your insurance company is all over you also. You have to think really carefully about what those specs in the bus are. And if you're not totally comfortable with some standard that APTA came up with, you're just going to stick with what you had before.
We cover a lot of different urban planning topics on here. And when I was reading the report, I was just continuously thinking that the agencies are very NIMBY. They were it feels like there's some things that could change that, like right now, the cities don't want a lot more housing in some parts. And then the state of California, for example, is like, no, you have to build more housing. And it feels kind of something similar, where we need to have us be able to build more buses at a cheaper rate, or else we're just going to end up getting to the point where we're spending a ridiculous amount on a bus, and it takes away from operating funds or other capital funds or something along those lines. And so I kind of just got a feeling of NIMBYism from all this. And I don't know if that's right or wrong. Maybe you guys can tell me, but it just feels silly that, like, I wrote down this note about a bike sensor where you needed to re-engineer the wiring harness. And I'm sitting here with my phone, and this phone has an accelerometer and everything else, and it does a million different things. Obviously, Apple makes millions of these things, but that would cause like a whole shakeup of the system. And so how much is this is kind of like the agencies being NIMBY-ish, the manufacturers being NIMBY-ish, and then just wanting to go about their way the same way they've always done it. And passengers like me who ride a bus every day really honestly don't care if the window's square or round.
I really think the transit agencies are doing what they think is best for them, and I don't blame them. So the example you gave of the bicycle rack is really interesting. It's in Seattle, and the King County Metro, that's the big bus operator up in Seattle, they wanted to offer a feature where you could look at your phone and know whether there's a space on a bike rack for your bicycle. I think that's fantastic, right? Like,
it makes sense.
Yeah, the bus is coming in 6 minutes, but if the next 3 buses are all filled with bikes, you can't put it on. The trouble is, when King County Metro insists on having these bike sensors on. It just, there's a lot of customization that has to go into the bus. It's not just the rack, but it's integrating with all the other hardware and software in there. And then getting that information onto an app. It's expensive, it's a little kludgy, but the transit agency is just trying to be responsive because at the end of the day, they want their customers to be happy. And if your operators are happier, their customers are going to be happier.
I think one of the recommendations you had in your report, Phil, that I really liked had to do with the transparency about sort of helping agencies understand what the difference might be if they put in a spec that is not sort of a standard baseline bus spec on something, and just understanding what the difference is. And actually, again, it's not even just the customization. It would also be true for putting in certain types of terms and conditions that are not sort of what we consider to be best practice or standard, and what the cost would be. Could be anything, I don't know, with longer warranties or, whatever it might be. I really liked that recommendation a lot because I think part of this is just having a real sort of awareness, like a concrete, quantitative way to understand what you're doing if you ask for something that's different and it's maybe is going to increase cost. And then the other thing about it is then you can say, okay, now I understand what this is going to cost me. And you can make an informed decision. And your decision might be kind of like with the bike racks or whatever. We're still going to do that because that's what our customers really want, or, for whatever it is, whatever the reason is going to be. But you can make, I think, a much better, more informed decision that way. And I'm sure some agencies will be driven to not make some of those decisions for something that really isn't providing customer value. Again, the bike rack provides clear customer value, arguably different, colors of the white or whatever it is are not necessarily, right? And I think the agency might say, okay, this doesn't provide real operational or performance value. We're not going to go that route. So I really think that's a big part of it, is just having a real clear sort of a concrete understanding of what the differences are from the choices you make.
I'm so glad that Lisa liked that recommendation because I had a whole bunch that she didn't like.
Right.
And trying to get the advisory panel to like a recommendation wasn't so easy.
Well, that's what I kind of, when I was reading about the agencies that tried to like get together and actually do something, and then nothing ever happened because the only thing it was going to do was benefit the manufacturer and not the agencies. It seemed like they're almost incentivized to continue to do the same thing. And so your comment about the recommendations that they didn't like, maybe that was along the same lines. I don't know. I also wonder, Lisa, what's the complaint that you hear most from like agencies about this process or, the whole thing? Because I'm sure that you get people being like, I hate this, or this is so annoying, or like, why are they doing this? And why can't we do it this way?
Yeah, well, Phil mentioned about sort of differences between what a larger agency might do and the smaller or mid-sized ones. Larger agencies do have a lot of resources, so they can come up with their own specs and then do all of this, and they understand, they have a lot of people doing the procurements. Smaller agencies, they just don't have that kind of like staff resource, and it's a complicated thing to be doing. I mean, listeners would not be able to see if I held up the white book that we have. It's a really thick, like I said, 300-page thing. That's not something that a small agency is going to have the time necessarily to go through and really kind of rework and do differently and understand what's sort of the latest best practice. So I would say that's part of it, is just honestly just like sheer, time, resources from your staff. But then also, I think in fairness, they want to understand what's the benefit to me, not just, am I just doing this because I think it's going to help a bus manufacturer? I mean, yes, they're partners in a way. They want bus manufacturers to be healthy and to be around. That's good for them. But I think it's also important to sort of stress that there are benefits to the agencies as well, which could be a shorter procurement process. I mean, I think that's one of our goals with this whole effort, is to say, just could, if you streamline the procurements, if you streamline the specs, could speed up the procurement process. That's good for everybody. I definitely think the agencies are conscious. They do want to be like good stewards of federal funding. They're aware there's not like an unlimited supply of it. So if they can reduce the cost of their buses, that's obviously a benefit to them. So I think that's part of it. Is just sort of, some of it is just like sort of capacity for the agencies. Some of it is making sure that they understand what's sort of the real like direct benefit to them to making these changes.
One thing to understand about a transit agency, and I think there's a saying, if you've seen one transit agency, you've seen one transit agency, because they're all different, right?
Yes.
One thing to understand about all of them, though, is they all have these little fiefdoms, and everybody has different perceptions and different interests. So you could be the head of an agency, and I know this happened, and you can go to these conferences and say, oh, yeah, we need more standardization and less customization. But then you go back and you'll talk to the head of your bus maintenance facility who'll say, sure, we could do that, but I don't know if the brakes are going to be any good. Or, oh, the supplier for that product, did you know that they make it like in our town and it's an important manufacturing job creation for our community? Or that they have their parts that they store on the expressway, not too far from here. So then you're the transit agency and you hear, oh, the mayor's not going to be happy if I do this. Or if there's an accident, I'm going to be in trouble, right? Or it's going to be harder to get parts. And you're going to go back and say, okay, I think I'm not going to overstep the maintenance guy because he knows what he's doing. He's been doing this for 20 or 30 years and he knows sort of things inside and out.
I mean, there's a joke here in San Francisco from people on the outside, at least, that's like, if the maintenance people had their way, we'd only run 40-foot buses and we wouldn't have streetcars, we wouldn't have cable cars, we wouldn't have light rail or anything else because that's what they would want to do. And so, you know.
Also, they wouldn't want any passengers.
They probably, yeah.
Because passengers really wreck schedules and everything.
Yeah. Transit planning, like, is another, that's a whole other ball game of like, well, why are we putting this station here if it's not cost effective to the FTA formula? Like, you know, there's a reason why we have stations, obviously, but it would generate more speed between the stations if there were less of them. So yeah, it's funny like how that goes back to my comment about NIMBYism. It's like all these little tiny things, and it all makes sense, obviously. Like you want to make your operators happy. You don't want grumpy operators. You don't want your maintenance people to be super grumpy either, and things like that.
Well, the other thing to also keep in mind too is you also have to think about what your board oversight is like. And, you know, if you have to go to explain to the board about why it is that your buses were delayed or the prices increased or, you know, whatever it is. So there's all kinds of different little pressure points, I think, that can make it kind of challenging to make big changes.
There's something I want to bring up, which is the technology in a bus. I think it's really important to understand. And when I talk to the old timers, and it's really always fun to talk to the old timers.
Can I get you to hold on for 1 second? I want to read something.
Okay.
The central computer connects and manages virtually every other electronic system on the bus, including destination signs, event recorders, emergency alarms, fare collection equipment, next stop announcements, passenger counting systems, stop request systems, security cameras, two-way radios, vehicle diagnostics. The main computer also connects to the computer-aided dispatch, automated vehicle location system, which integrates GPS tracking with dispatching software to monitor vehicle locations and track schedule adherence. Directly from your report. Continue.
Thanks. There's a lot of computer systems there. A lot of them are proprietary and they're not interoperable. And if you're a bus manufacturer, I mean, you can't imagine, again, but going back to a car dealer and telling them what kind of computer systems to put into their car, if it's the camera systems, right? Or the systems that automatically stop, or these audio alerts when you change lanes, right? There's all these like great safety systems in there. But the transit agencies use different systems. There's not one system, and they don't necessarily talk to each other. So they're expensive, they're complicated, and once a transit agency has gotten these systems, it's not easy to change. So they want their entire fleet, let's say, to have the same maintenance system. So when a bus comes into a bus depot, you can plug it in or wirelessly get the information about all of the different problems and concerns that you have to worry about with the bus, or when it needs new tires, or when it has to get an oil change. So all of the systems are talking to each other, and if they're interoperable and proprietary, it's causing a problem, and it's just going to get worse.
Are we closer to solving this problem?
Well, I did talk to somebody at the United States Department of Transportation, like 2 days before we released the report, and asked them about standards.
Yes.
I asked him, like, what's going on? And he said to me, we don't do standards here. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, U.S. Department of Transportation, we will identify potential standards. We'll recommend standard committees do standards. And he said, as a matter of fact, we're going to be coming out with a report that recommends there should be certain standards. And that report will come out in a couple of years. And then these standard committees will then look at those recommendations and then consider whether there should be a standard, and then they'll bring the right people together and then they'll develop the standard. It takes a little while, huh?
Well, Phil, you know who does create standards?
Ooh,
APTA. That's part of what we do. So that is a big challenge, honestly. It really is. And it is something that we are looking at in our standards program. It's actually not in the area that I focus on myself. So I don't, but I know it's something that we're thinking that we might start tackling under our APTA standards program is some kind of, unified interface or some kind of standardized, whatever it is, that will help all these different pieces of technology integrate better. It's easier said than done, to say the least, but I agree that that is something that is it's a real challenge for the agencies to work all that out, to get all these different pieces, and challenge for the manufacturers to figure out too, to put all these pieces together and have them all talk to each other.
yeah. Our report recommended that federal government provide the resources that APTA needs to do that kind of work. But one of the challenges APTA has is it's not just public transportation vehicles, right? It's other kinds of vehicles that are using that sort of same technology. So it's a difficult thing to bring everybody together to develop a standard.
Yeah. So what are some of the other recommendations from the report?
One is making sure people understand what's going on. So people understand the White Book, the benefits of the White Book, and also the benefits of something called a state schedule or a state contract. So instead of 10 different transit agencies in Ohio issuing a request for proposal and developing all the specs for a bus, it's better if a state can issue that one RFP, the manufacturers can respond to it, and then each of the transit agencies could then buy buses off the contracts that are executed from that RFP. So these are state contracts or state schedules, and federal government now allows an agency to purchase a bus from any state. So if the state of Washington is actually, that's a really popular place for bus transit agencies to purchase their buses. So a bus agency in Huntsville, Alabama doesn't have to issue its own RFP. They could just look at all the information that's available on one of these state contracts in the state of Washington, and they can purchase the bus off of that. That'll help create better standards. It'll streamline the process. It makes it easier for manufacturers. There's benefits for everybody to encourage people to use the White Book and the state schedule, and to do them together would be really helpful. Another thing is, how do you provide a financial incentive for the agencies to be using the White Book and these state schedules? And it's money. It's like you'll get more money if you do it, and you get less money if you don't do it. And at the end of the day, that's really what's going to make the difference, having different financial incentives. And there's different ways to structure it. And I'm not wedded, and Eno's not wedded to a certain thing, but really the idea is, how do you change people's priorities? And you do that with federal money.
Yeah, I saw the recommendation. It's in your report, but also, as I mentioned, we talked with the IFP folks about the report that they did recently on costs. And one of the things was saying, like, you should just, instead of doing a percentage of the total what you buy, you should just have a cap. And so I know that that's tricky in a way, because, you could get certain things happening. There's always something that you don't know about when you're trying to, put it together, legislation, and when you're trying to do these things. But that was an interesting one to me, which is, putting a cap and saying, if you want to spend $600,000, we'll pay for all the bus. Or if you want to spend 700, you get to spend, you get to pay 100,000 per bus from your own funding. And if you want all these customization things, et cetera. So there's some interesting solutions out there that people are talking about that agencies may or may not like.
That was one of the ones that probably Phil was referring to when he said it was challenging to get us to agree to all those recommendations. I honestly did like a lot of them. That is the one that recommendation to me. The issue with it is it's a little arbitrary, right? You're putting on this cap without really having an awareness of, like the manufacturing industry for transit is going to be subject to all of the same like macro forces that everything is right now, right? You've got inflation, you've got different types of supply chain challenges, you've got tariffs that of course drives up prices, any kind of, regulatory things on the transit bus market can drive up the price of the bus. So I will say, APTA is definitely not in favor of that particular approach. Again, I think it sort of puts transit buses for some reason at a disadvantage that other types of infrastructure really aren't at. And again, it doesn't reflect whatever might be happening with the overall like market and prices. What I think does make sense is, and this happened with the FTA's, the Low-No program that they had for zero and low emission buses, which is you would get you would get some kind of additional credit, something to that effect, if you are using the white book for your spec. And so it means it's more advantageous for you to use the white book and to, secure certain types of federal funding. That kind of thing. Incentivizing, which is what Phil said, incentivizing use of the white book. We're a fan of that. Or the state contracts are also a great pathway forward.
As somebody who's been watching all these costs go up for a long time and appreciating what the IFP folks been saying, not just about bus stuff, but also the construction of mega projects and stuff like that, it's getting a little ridiculous. Especially when you see in Austin, which is my hobby horse, Austin, because I went to the University of Texas and I did my master's on the history of urban rail financing and projects and all that stuff, that you can build a subway in Milan for 14 kilometers for the same amount of price as you're going to pay for a surface light rail line in Austin for the same cost. So there's just like a lot of that stuff that's going around where, I looked up electric buses in China. It's like $200,000 per bus or less. And they're all electric nowadays. And so, I can't help but look at other countries and think like, oh, I wish we could be closer to that, because then we could get more buses, we get more service. I just went around canvassing to get SFMTA and the Bay Area transit agencies more money. I'd get signatures so that we could have this on the ballot so we could vote for it. But one of the things is like, if I'm going to do that and if I'm going to go around and ask people to give their signature to me to put something on the ballot that they would vote for to give Muni more money, I want us to also be good stewards of our money as well. That's a whole other thing, Muni having a different thing with our own trolley buses and 60-foot buses and 40-foot buses and everything else that we have in the report. So, and also my daughter and I take a PCC to school every morning. So, there's interesting historical precedents too that kind of pop out at me daily. I do have one last question for you all. What's something that you wish people would know about this process that maybe gets overlooked?
There's some case studies in our report. And the favorite thing I wrote about was the PCC streetcar, which was a standard rail car that the manufacturers and operators together came up with. And they built thousands of them. They were used all over the world. It was more efficient and they were faster and more comfortable, really popular. And you can still see them.
I ride one every morning.
Yeah. And that inspired the federal government to create a standard in the early 1970s. They said, oh, if the manufacturers could do it in the 1920s, we could do it in the 1970s. So Congress set aside some money, the equivalent of about $200 million today, to create what they called the trans bus in the early 1970s. This was a 9-year program. And the idea was they're going to develop a standard bus. And I think this is just really fascinating to think about. The federal government is creating the standard bus. And any transit agency in the country that wants to purchase a bus would purchase the standard bus. And they had all these wonderful goals. So it was, if you had a standard bus, it would promote more competition in the bus industry, not just one or two manufacturers, which was the case at the time. You could lower the cost to build them, and they would design the buses so they were less expensive to operate, easier to maintain, they'd be more reliable, more comfortable. They would be able to handle wheelchairs, which was a new thing at the time, and reduce diesel emissions. So really great idea. And what the federal government did, it was the predecessor of the Federal Transit Administration. They awarded 3 contracts to companies to come up with these designs. And the companies made these prototypes. And the APTA, that was the Urban Mass Transit Administration, they announced, okay, now we have one prototype. We're sort of combining all 3. And 3 transit agencies got together in 1979, and they issued this RFP for buses. They were going to buy more than 500 buses, and all of these manufacturers were going to come and bid on it. And they got 0 bids. So this is like a 9 or 10-year process to develop a standard bus. They have the design, the transit agencies issued the request, and no manufacturer was interested. And they weren't interested because they figured it was going to cost too much to make, and the design, it would be expensive to maintain. Their buses were going to be less fuel efficient than the ones they had. It would need more parts. It was a lot of experimental components they weren't really comfortable with. Like you can imagine, if the federal government is designing the brakes and you're not comfortable with it, you don't really want to manufacture it. So there were all these different issues with it, and the federal government pulled the plug. So nearly $200 million, 7-year or 9-year process to come up with the buses, and then it just didn't work. And I think there's just a lot of lessons in there about who should design it, who needs to be at the table. And one of the wonderful things I like about APTA is they have everybody at the table. They're not like sitting on their own trying to come up with these white book standards. They really get everybody there and battling it out what these specs should look like. And bringing the manufacturers to say, this is what we could build and this is what we can't build. Getting the operators to say, oh yeah, these are our priorities when it comes to putting a bus together. So great story for the 1970s. That's what I think people should know.
I don't know if I have a thing necessarily I wish everybody knew. I guess my feeling is that there isn't like some magic button that we're going to push that's going to just suddenly, I don't know, make buses less expensive and make this whole process just kind of resolve itself. We, the industry, really are working toward creating a better procurement process. But I would want everyone to understand that, again, it's not like a magic thing. The panel that we were on before, Phil, where Holly Arnold from the Maryland MTA talked about they had adopted some of the new specifications and also I think some of the new contract terms maybe from our white book. And it was great. I mean, they had a really good experience, but I think, what did she say? They saved like 17,000. I think it was something like that, which is great. That's a great result. But, it's still a pretty small percentage overall, the bus. So I just want everyone to kind of keep a bigger picture here, of how to improve this process overall. Absolutely be good stewards of federal funding and also good, thinking about what your customers want, thinking about how you're going to provide the best service you can provide. But we want to avoid sort of magical thinking about it as well. And just sort of, sometimes it is kind of like a step-by-step incremental thing. And we're making progress and maybe not as dramatic as people might want it to be, but it's happening and it'll keep happening.
We're going to put this report in the show notes so people can download it. But where can folks find you all if you wish to be found?
enotrans.org, enotrans.org.
And yeah, we are apta.com. If you go there, you will find all kinds of things.
All kinds of things.
Exactly.
Folks should go. And then they can find out where they can go to the next conference and whatnot, right? There's so many of them.
Conferences. They'll find out about our standards programs. They'll find, you name it. It's over there.
Awesome. Well, Philip and Lisa, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Well, it was fun. And I hope your listeners think that bus procurement is a fun topic also.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire, published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can sign up for our 20-year-old newsletter as well and find everything else, including multiple ways to support the show, at theoverheadwire.com. You can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.